any of these have been.
What is the motive for all this underreporting then? Because, I mean, you're talking about at least a $15 billion a year trade now, African gold going to Dubai. That's depriving governments that are already pretty hard-pressed in terms of state revenues of a vital amounts of capital. Is this? Do you think there's some sort of political collusion going on here? And how does it work? I mean, who benefits?
Well, I think obviously, the governments are realizing the scale of what's happening, and on one level, obviously, it is offering people a livelihood. It's providing people opportunities in areas where there are not many other things to do. So artisanal mining, left to its own devices, was creating opportunities for people, but it's also become, I think it's growing to become a scale that, governments are realizing that this is actually also something that potentially they could benefit from if it was more formalized. That taxation, whether taxation at a local level, but also on the export. But I think also in terms of capital flight and various other issues are coming into play when you start talking about these values of gold.
Is there like a problem now, were they to try to formalize it, after the horse has bolted, are there now, too many criminal syndicates operating at too high a level, able to pay off, mayors, able to pay off mining ministers, or whatever it took to keep the process going? Doesn't it now make it much, much harder if they want to regulate?
I think it is harder, and Ghana's experience shows how hard it is. I mean, as you said, Ghana's a state that has, the infrastructure, and yet it's faced serious challenges. And us, the Ghanaian journalist, showed how easy it was. He had a series of officials, from mining officials to police and the army, on camera taking bribes to be allowed to continue mining during the ban. So yes, absolutely, it's tough. Whether it's too hard, I've got no idea.
What I saw in the DRC is that the tax rates are so high that it would seem that there's a sort of unofficial, deliberate policy to discourage formal exports, because if you were, as an exporter of gold from Congo, if you were to go through all the hoops and pay all the taxes, then you're ending up that you've already gone. It's gone too much. You've gone over the LBMA price. So I think there's it's designed that way. And when you see how much how artisanal gold mines in the country are sort of taken as the fiefdom of army commanders or politicians, one wonders if these high tax rates aren't part of that sort of strategy.
Are you suggesting, Greg, to follow your logic, that the entire political elite of the Congo are in some way involved in a criminal syndicate to extract mineral wealth from the country?
Heaven forbid. No, I'm just struck that the Congo's, DRC's taxes on gold are way higher than their neighbours.
How do the corporates get around that then? I mean, if you're running a regular mining company registered, with the mining cadastre and everything else, how do you operate then? If it's not economic for small-scale artisanal miners, how does it become economic for a corporate entity?
The corporates don't have to pay some of the taxes that artisanal miners and traders have to pay when they're paying them. But still, they are complaining about the corporate tax rates. That's why Rand Gold, or now Barrick Gold, is making such a noise about the mining code.
Because, yes, Mark Bristow and co.
Mark Bristow and co, yes.
But, take that to Ghana, where there's a bit of a row in Ghana about Anglo-American dates me, Ashanti Goldfields, getting a major tax exoneration to restart operations at the Obuasi mine. Yet at the same time, the government's clamping down on small-scale mining. It seems like they're kind of trying to tilt to the big companies. Is that?
Yeah, I don't know if I don't know if I can speak for Ghana, but what I see is that it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to operate a small scale artisanal trading operation legally and profitably.
Right. And anywhere on the continent? Certainly in Congo.
Certainly in Congo, I think that the tax rates are extraordinarily high.
And I mean, is it the same argument that goes for small and medium scale enterprises in Africa as a great generator of labour and value in general for the society? Do you think, if properly handled, artisanal mining could play the same role in the mining sector, or it's just too complex, too difficult,
The
too
difficulty
dodgy?
with artisanal mining as a way to promote state development is that you never get the concentration of tax revenues that enable the authorities to do much with them, even if they were going to do something with them.
Right.
So, for example, we've seen in the tin sector this new industrial tin mine coming on site into production in Walikale in North Kivu. Now, before there were tens of thousands of artisanals selling their material. It was being flown out in Antonovs to Goma and then out, but there was absolutely nothing to show for it on the ground. There were no clinics, no hospitals, no nothing. But now with an industrial miner there, you're starting to see some of that infrastructure coming up. So I think it's pretty hard to develop an economy through artisanal mining. You provide employment, income keeps coming in, but it's in a kind of piecemeal way. It never gets to that levels of concentration that you get much development of it.
What about those who want to see industrial policy to promote local content, so that, I don't know, the gloves and the ball bearings for a particular mine must be made locally by a local partner? Has that had any traction, or does it remain a fantasy of the industrial policy enthusiasts?
Beneficiation. Well, you run up against other constraints, typically energy, parts, supply chain problems. We've seen in the industrial mining sector in southern DRC and the copper and cobalt sector that there used to be, back in the day, a whole lot of industrial activity associated with mining. It's nearly all fallen away. So now mostly it's access from Zambia or from South Africa. So at a continental level, I guess there's some beneficiation, but in country, less so.
What about the response from the UAE? Because they, they have their own interests at a more geostrategic level in Sudan, also in Ethiopia. They want help from the Horn of Africa in prosecuting a war in Yemen. Are they at all worried about the reputational impact of an investigation such as the one that Reuters did?
Well, we struggle to get any comment from them, so you can take that the way you want to. I mean, they certainly. I mean, the UAE has launched its own responsible sourcing program called Dubai Good Delivery, which is meant to raise the standards of the members of the DMCC, the Dubai Multi-Commodity Centre, which is it plays the role of both promoting and supposedly regulating the industry. So there's
no conflict of interest there, I presume.
So
it's all above board.
In theory, the members of if you're on the DGG list, you've met certain criteria, and Dubai has certainly come under pressure to try and raise that bar, so that and there is some cross recognition between Dubai's system and other industry schemes, but there's certainly the argument that off the record UAE officials will say is that we have this scheme, but actually there's also a lot of people operating outside that is not, we can't regulate in the same way, and there certainly seems to be a lot of getting a clear indication of how much goes through Dubai Good Delivery and how much is passing through the parallel channels is not easy. There's virtually no data. We were given no data. We can't tell it from the data, but certainly there's certainly a case that's happening.
Patrick, on the sort of the difficult subject of international agreements to do anything in the era of America First, it does seem that there is a bit of a moment for international tax treaties. Tax Justice NGO in the UK are yet again trying to sort of raise consciousness around the issue of tax haven and illicit flows. This obviously falls squarely into that, in terms of Africa losing, by mispricing. I think you had someone who in the Reuters report says this is a classic mispricing trick which is going on. Where do you think Africa stands in terms of global bodies who are actually focused on this?
Well, I think the political will is seeping away, to be honest. I mean, the OECD has been seized, which is not a rich man's club at all. It's there to promote ideas about developing the world, making it a better place.
Yeah.
Just happens to be in the 16th arrondissement. Can't help that. So I think the political will is lessening. It's quite obvious with for example, we were talking earlier about Dodd-Frank. I mean, somebody at the OECD meeting today had to say, I remind you that Dodd-Frank is still a fact. It's still operating. It's an inefficient, it doesn't cover the whole Africa export trade by any means. It's just Congo and neighbors. But it was an attempt to stop irregular sourcing and to stop the supply chains of conflict minerals. It was a serious attempt, and it doesn't cover Sudan, for example. So that it even has weaknesses, but it is existing at the moment. But it has been under threat, and I think on the tax treaty issue, the OECD has been arguing about this with developing countries outside its own club. And they haven't reached much of a consensus about how to monitor these tax treaties, the country-by-country accounting standards and things like that. So I think the question a lot of countries in Africa would be asking themselves is where do we get the leverage, where do we get the political will to do this and to take on these organizations and to get our own case across, both on the international stage but also in terms of those activists in Africa that are pushing this agenda. How do they succeed? For an example, the Economic Commission for Africa, under the auspices of the Mbeki panel, then produced its report and said at least 50 billion a year goes out of Africa in illicit financial flows. And I spoke to members of the team that put that report together, and they said, it was a real battle to get that report onto the agenda of the African Union, because that year the African Union was meeting in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea, which is seen by some as the poster child for illicit financial flows. So not only are they battling against an international system which seems to have lost interest, to be honest, in things like tax justice and stopping conflict minerals, at least as a top table issue, but they're also battling against their own political elites in many countries. So I think they're in for a tough time getting these issues on the table. I think the one piece of optimism you could say is stuff like David's work with Reuters, getting this out there in the public domain, and data journalism in general, more access to analysts and statistics about this stuff. That's going to help the cause, because you get to a stage where it's not just a sort of an ideological position that this is going on, but there's a serious attempt to understand and quantify the problem, and then it can be put out there, and then you can argue about it. I mean, that's the problem with illicit flows, is a lot of people say, well, they don't really exist, it's just a really capital flight. But if you can get to a stage where you can quantify it and show where it's coming from and where it's going to, then at least you've got a serious hope of doing something about it.
Gregory, I don't know, first, if you want to comment on that, whether the Obama era was the sort of the high water mark of an attempt at least to push progress on these matters. But also, in Congo, obviously the Chinese have a huge interest. There is this big Belt Road Initiative conference happening today in China. Is there any African country who is using the potential arbitrage between Western investors and Chinese investors to get better deals on minerals?
Well, first, I think one should doff one's cap, at least partially, to this new EU regulations on conflict minerals.